The tunnel was already groaning when Vesper Holt made her fourth crossing of the night. She knew the sound by then, knew the difference between the low, steady creak of wood settling under cold and the sharper, more urgent complaint of something near its limit. The ridgepole above her head made the second kind of sound. She raised the lantern higher, watching the canvas walls pulse inward with each gust, watching the shadows jump and retreat. At the 40-foot mark, exactly there where she'd known all along the weakness lived, the ceiling bowed down toward her by nearly a foot, packed so dense on the outside that the canvas had gone rigid as iron plate. She shifted the broomstick handle to her right hand, positioned it against the bulge, and pushed upward in 3 short, hard strokes. The snow gave way with a muffled sliding sound, and the ceiling lifted back. The groaning eased but didn't stop. She stood there for a moment in the dark passage, listening to the storm try to find her. It was January 12th, 1888. The temperature outside had dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes, and whatever was happening beyond the canvas walls bore no resemblance to weather as she had understood it before tonight. She would think about that later. Right now, she had 42 feet left to walk 2 cows waiting on the other side and a lantern that needed to last. She kept moving. 8 months earlier, on a Tuesday in May, the world had been a different kind of place. The post office in Harlan's Creek occupied the front quarter of Dunmore's general store, separated from the dry goods by a pine counter worn smooth by 10 years of elbows. Vesper had driven 14 miles from the homestead, with Sable beside her on the wagon bench, and Cade and Rue, in the bed behind all 3 children, promised penny candy if they sat still for the ride and didn't fight over the blanket. They'd managed the sitting still. The fighting had been ongoing since the Platte River crossing, low and persistent, the kind of argument that burned at embers rather than flame, who had more blanket, who had breathed on whose side, whether Rue had looked at Cade in the specific way Cade found intolerable. Vesper had let it run. She was thinking about the letter. August had written in February a single page. In his careful, slightly labored hand he'd taught himself to read at 20, which meant his penmanship always looked like a man concentrating hard on something that didn't come naturally. The letter said the winter cut was ahead of schedule. The foreman at Western Timber was pleased. He expected to be home by late April, maybe sooner if the river stayed clear for log drives. He'd drawn a small picture at the bottom for Rue, who was 4 and too young to read a horse with an improbably large head and a grin that no actual horse had ever worn. Rue had slept with that page for 3 weeks. By the first week of May, he hadn't come. Vesper had told herself the river. She'd told herself the cut running long. She'd told herself a dozen sensible things in the hour before dawn, when sensible things are hardest to believe lying in the dark, listening to the wind move across the sandhills in long, low sweeps that sounded almost like breathing. The letter at the post office counter was not from August. Ezra Dunmore slid it across without comment, which told her something about his face when he'd received it, told her he'd read the return address, Western Timber Company, Omaha, and understood before she did what that particular sender writing to a homestead wife in May was likely to mean. He'd been behind that counter for a long time. He knew how certain envelopes moved through a room. Vesper took it to the window. The light was better there, she told herself. The light was fine everywhere in the small building, but the window put her back to Dunmore, which was what she actually needed. She read it 3 times. 14 words. She counted them on the second reading, not because she'd missed anything, but because counting gave her hands something to do. August Holt, killed in mill accident, body shipped to Omaha. Condolences, Foreman Briggs, Western Timber. The period at the end of condolences was heavier than it needed to be pressed into the paper by whoever had typed it, a machine's period indifferent to what it was ending. Outside the window, Sable sat straight on the wagon bench with the particular posture of a 10-year-old who has been given responsibility and intends to honor it. Cade had apparently resolved the blanket dispute in his favor. Rue was watching a dog cross the street with the absolute concentration only 4-year-olds and certain philosophers can sustain. Vesper folded the letter along its original creases. She put it in her coat pocket. She turned from the window. Dunmore was rearranging items on a shelf that didn't require rearranging. The candy cost 3 cents. She had exact change, which meant she didn't have to speak while Dunmore measured it out. She said thank you when he handed it over. He said you're welcome in the voice of a man who knows the words are wrong for the moment, but has no better ones available. The bell above the door rang when she walked out. Sable took one look at her mother's face and said nothing. She was 10, which was old enough in 1887 Nebraska to understand that some information traveled ahead of words. She distributed the candy to Cade and Rue with unusual efficiency, no ceremony, no negotiation. Cade accepted his portion without complaint. Even Rue seemed to sense that this was not a moment for her standard comprehensive review of whether her share was adequate. 14 miles home. Vesper kept the horse at a steady pace, not urgent, not slow. The sandhills moved past on both sides those long grass-covered dunes that looked from a distance like a gentle country and revealed their character only in winter, when the wind found nothing to break against for 100 miles. The sky was blue all the way to the edge of everything. May in Nebraska before the heat came was the most dishonestly beautiful month the calendar offered. She didn't speak for the entire drive. The children didn't ask her to. When they reached the homestead, she unhitched the horse, led him to water, measured out his grain, with the same care she always used because the horse's needs didn't reorganize themselves around human grief. She fed the chickens, 23 of them, scattered across the yard, in their usual pointless investigations of ground they had already investigated completely. She went to the barn and milked both cows, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm, while her mind sat very still somewhere behind her eyes, not yet ready to move. The milk filled the pails. The cows shifted their weight and blew long breath through their nostrils, patient and present, in the way animals are present entirely in the moment they occupy. She put the children to bed. Sable helped Rue with her buttons without being asked. Cade fell asleep before Vesper finished with Rue, which was unusual for him. He was a child who fought sleep as a matter of principle, and she understood that even children absorb shock in their bodies before they understand it in their minds. Then she sat at the kitchen table and didn't move until the kerosene lamp burned itself down to nothing. In the dark, she did arithmetic. $312 in the tin box under the floorboard beneath the bed. She'd counted it in February when August left, and she knew the number the way she knew her children's birthdays, not as something looked up, but as something lived in. $312. 2 dairy cows that together produced enough milk to sell 8 gallons weekly to the Dunmore store at 12 cents a gallon, which worked out to $1 in a week and 4 cents if she was exact about it. 23 chickens yielding eggs at a rate that varied by season, but averaged perhaps 30 dozen monthly sold at 15 cents, a dozen $4.50 in a good month less in winter. 1 aging draft horse that could still pull but couldn't be pushed. A sod house 12 by 16 feet with a dirt floor and windows covered in oiled paper that let in light of a certain diffuse, ambiguous quality. A sod barn 82 feet from the back door, holding the hay she'd cut the previous summer and whatever hay she could cut this coming one. The Homestead Act required 5 years of continuous residence to receive title to the land. Not 4 years and 11 months, not 5 years, minus a season spent somewhere more survivable. She and August had filed in the spring of 1886. They had completed 18 months. 42 remained. She could leave. She could pack the children and the $312 and drive to Kearney, find work of some kind, let the claim lapse. The land would revert. Someone else would file on it, maybe next season, maybe the one after. The creek in the southeast corner, that thin, reliable thread of water that ran year-round when every other water source in a 5-mile radius went dry, would belong to whoever filed next. She would have 18 months of breaking sod and cutting hay and patching a house that tried to melt back into the ground every spring and nothing to show for it but children fed and a husband buried somewhere outside Omaha at Western Timber Company's expense. Or she could stay. The lamp finished burning. She sat in the dark for a while longer. Then she went to bed because morning came whether you were ready for it or not, and the cows didn't understand anything except that they needed milking at the same hour they always needed it. The morning came. She got up. Cormac Aldrin arrived on the 3rd day, which was how long it took for news to move from the post office counter through the particular network of casual conversation that served the Harlan's Creek settlement as a telegraph. He came at mid-morning when she was splitting wood behind the house. She heard his horse before she saw him. Aldrin rode a gray that moved with an unhurried authority that matched its owner. He stopped at the fence line. He didn't dismount. She'd noticed this about him on the 2 previous occasions their paths had crossed at the general store last fall. At the water rights meeting the county had organized in September, that he conducted conversations from horseback when he had the option, which created a particular geometry of the exchange that wasn't accidental. At 54, with 11 years of Nebraska behind him and more acres under his name than any other single holder in the county, Cormac Aldrin knew exactly what altitude did for a negotiation. Mrs. Holt. His hat came off briefly. I was sorry to hear about August. Vesper set the axe into the chopping block and straightened. The sun was behind him, which meant she was looking into it. She didn't move to change that. Thank you for coming. It's a hard thing. He turned the hat brim in his hands, a gesture that looked like discomfort and probably wasn't. A woman alone out here, 3 young ones. The country isn't forgiving of that situation. No, she said, it isn't. I imagine you'll want to think about your options. The hat went back on. He resettled it with the deliberateness of a man returning to business. The homestead you've got, what, 1.5 years completed. You'd be walking away from improvements, but I could make that right. Give you fair value for what you've put in. Enough to get yourself to Kearney, maybe Omaha, get the children settled somewhere with more. He paused, selecting the word. Support. Vesper looked at him for a moment. What's your interest in this particular piece of ground, Mr. Aldrin? Something moved briefly across his face. Not guilt, men like Aldrin didn't carry guilt about commerce, but something that acknowledged she'd asked the precise correct question. It adjoins my east pasture. Makes sense for the operation. The creek makes sense for the operation. The creek ran through the southeast corner of her 160 acres, a thin, constant ribbon of water that didn't depend on snowmelt or seasonal rain. In a country where water was the first fact of everything, what you could raise, how many animals you could carry through a dry summer, whether you had something to offer a buyer or just bare grass, that creek was worth more than the rest of the land combined. She'd understood this since the day August had driven the stakes in, and she'd walked the perimeter of their claim. August had understood it too. It was why they'd filed on this particular quarter section when there were cheaper ones available to the east. Aldrin didn't answer directly, which was its own kind of answer. There's another option, of course. A woman who works hard proved up land under her. There are men in this county who'd consider that a reasonable proposition. Wouldn't have to be permanent hardship. You mean remarriage? I mean practical thinking. He said it without embarrassment because he saw no reason for embarrassment. He was describing a transaction which was how he understood most human arrangements. Before winter. That's the timeline that matters. What happens between your door and that barn when a real blizzard hits? That's not a problem a woman solves alone. Vesper picked up the axe. I appreciate you coming out. Aldrin looked at her, at the axe, at her face, at whatever he read there. He gathered his reins. The offer stands when you're ready to be sensible about it. He turned the gray and rode back the way he'd come, unhurried, not looking back. She split wood until her arms ached, and her breath came in the hard, clean gasps that leave no room for anything else. Then she stacked it against the house wall and went inside to start lunch. Della Pruitt came at the end of May riding side saddle despite her 68 years, which she'd explained once to no one in particular. Apparently, since she lived alone, was simply a matter of having learned one way and finding no compelling argument to change. She'd homesteaded the quarter section to the north in 1871 with her husband Carl, who died in a blizzard 2 years later. She had proved up the claim alone in 1873, which made her the only person in the county who'd done it without a husband, for the duration, a fact she mentioned rarely because she didn't find it required mention. She accepted coffee, which was the first thing Vesper offered, and the only thing she had to offer, and sat at the kitchen table while the children ate their lunch on the step outside within earshot, but with the specific diplomatic distance that Sable had begun maintaining around adult conversations since the letter arrived. Aldrin's been by, Della said. It wasn't a question. 3 days after the news. He moves fast when there's water involved. Della's hands circled the coffee cup, hands that had earned every line in them dry and strong and marked by decades of work that hadn't stopped just because she'd aged into them. He was watching this parcel since before you and August filed. There's no year-round water within 5 miles except what runs through your southeast corner. That's not sentiment, Mrs. Holt. That's just geography. He suggested remarriage. Of course he did. Della's voice held no particular heat, not contempt exactly, but the flat acknowledgement of a pattern recognized from long experience. Did he happen to mention what occurs to a homestead claim when the widow remarries? Vesper had looked it up. The law was clear upon marriage, a woman's property, including any homestead claim in her name or jointly held, transferred to her husband. Not complicated, not ambiguous. It goes to the husband. Just so. Della set it down the cup. And if that husband were to subsequently sell his suddenly expanded holdings to a neighbor with available cash, Aldrin gets the creek without putting his name on anything. Aldrin gets the creek, and you get to feel that you made a sensible choice. Della looked at her steadily. He's not cruel about it, you understand. He genuinely believes he's offering you a reasonable path. That's what makes him effective. Vesper was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Kate explaining something to Rue with the excessive confidence of a 7-year-old who has assembled a theory. Rue's response was inaudible but clearly skeptical. "Tell me about the barn crossings," Vesper said. Della was still for a beat. Then she set down the cup and folded her hands on the table in the way of someone about to describe something she doesn't enjoy remembering. "The rope is what everyone uses, a line from the house door to the barn door tied off at both ends. You go hand over hand when you can't see. In a standard winter storm, it works. In a real blizzard, the kind where the temperature drops 40 degrees in an hour and the wind runs 60 miles, the rope ices over. Ice an eighth of an inch thick on a rope in those temperatures, and you can't feel it through mittens. You grip what you think is rope, and you're gripping nothing, just smooth frozen cylinder that your hand slides right off of." Vesper waited. Edna Marsh died 40 feet from her back door in the winter of '81. They found her in the spring. She'd been walking away from both buildings when she fell, couldn't see, couldn't feel the rope, lost her orientation completely. In open white like that, you can walk in a perfect circle and believe you're going straight. Della picked up the cup again, held it without drinking. "I came close twice myself. The second time I crawled the last 30 feet on my belly because I couldn't stand in the wind. Took me 20 minutes to get the barn door shut. After I was inside, my hands wouldn't work. When I made it back to the house that time, I sat on the floor for an hour before I could stand up again." "But you stayed." "I stayed. I'd given 5 years to that ground, and I wasn't going to hand it to someone else because the winters were hard." Something shifted in Della's expression, not softened exactly, but made more specific, more personal. "But I didn't have children, Mrs. Holt. That changed the arithmetic for me in a way I can't fully calculate for you. When I crossed to the barn and back, the only life at risk was mine. I could take that risk. It was mine to take." She paused. "If you go out in a real blizzard and you lose the rope and you go down 40 feet from your door, your Sable is going to try to find you. She's 10 years old. She'll go out after you, and then you'll both be in the snow." The kitchen was very quiet. From outside, Cade's theoretical explanation had evolved into something requiring sound effects. "Is there another way?" Vesper asked. "Across to the barn, is there anything that works better than the rope?" Della looked at her for a long moment. "If there is, I never found it, and I thought about it for 17 years. She rode out in the late afternoon, growing small against the grass and sky until the distance took her. Vesper stood in the doorway watching her go. 82 feet to the barn door. She'd paced it the week they'd arrived just to know the number, a habit from her father's farm in Pennsylvania, where knowing distances was considered basic information, like knowing where the well was or which direction the worst weather came from. 82 feet. On a clear, calm day, she could cross it in under 30 seconds. She'd done it 1,000 times, maybe more, in all weathers except the worst. She didn't know yet what she was going to do, but she was starting to know what questions she needed to ask. June arrived in a long, grinding succession of days that began before the sun fully cleared the horizon and didn't end until it was too dark to see. Vesper cut hay with a scythe while the morning dew still lay heavy on the grass, because wet grass cut easier and the dew was gone by 8 o'clock, which was also when the heat began in earnest. She raked the cut grass into long windrows and left it to dry in the sun, then turned it once a day until it cured to the pale gold that meant it would keep through winter without molding. Then she loaded it onto the wagon, Sable managing the horse while Vesper pitched from the ground and drove it to the barn. Cade understood that he was the water carrier, which he took seriously with the particular gravity of a 7-year-old given a real job. He made the trip from the well to the hayfield 6, 8, 10 times a day, the bucket reducing his gait to a careful sideways lean that left his right shoulder consistently lower than his left. Rue fed the chickens and counted them after because Rue believed and had demonstrated through evidence that chickens would simply wander off into the prairie if not monitored with statistical regularity. By the end of June, 2 tons of hay in the barn. She needed 8. The garden had fallen behind. The chicken coop needed a new board on the west side where something had worked its way in 2 nights running and killed 3 hens before she'd found the gap. The sod roof of the house was leaking where the grass roots had died out on the south-facing slope, letting moisture through in a thin, persistent dribble that had stained the wall beneath. Every hour spent on hay was an hour stolen from something else, and every hour stolen from something else had consequences that stacked up with the patience of compound interest. She moved through the days with the focused tunnel vision of someone who has accepted that not everything will be managed, only triaged. But through all of it, in the back of some quiet room in her mind, the problem of 82 feet persisted. She thought about it in the early morning before the children woke. She thought about it while the scythe moved through its arc. She thought about it particularly on the hot, still evenings when she sat on the step after the children were in bed and watched the sandhills go from gold to copper to the particular blue-black that preceded dark. The rope was what everyone used. The rope had been good enough, mostly good enough, often enough that the custom had persisted. But often enough was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and Della Pruitt's words about Edna Marsh walking away from both buildings in the white didn't leave her. There had to be something between the rope and luck. July passed. August began. On a Thursday in the second week of August, a thunderstorm moved in from the southwest without much warning. The sky went from hazy to purple in about 40 minutes, and then the rain came down in the kind of sheets that turn a dirt yard into a shallow pond inside of 10 minutes. Vesper got the children inside and the horse into the barn, and then stood at the window watching the rain hammer the oiled paper, which bowed inward with each gust, and returned translucent and amber in the storm-dimmed afternoon light. The children settled into the quiet that bad weather imposed on them. Sable reading the same 3 books they owned in careful rotation, Cade constructing something architectural from firewood pieces on the floor, Rue asleep against the wall with her knees pulled up and her mouth slightly open. Vesper sat at the table. Her eyes went to the barn. She could see it through the rain, barely a dark shape at the edge of visibility 82 feet away, present and unreachable. Between the house and the barn there was nothing. Open ground. In a real blizzard, that ground would be as impossible to cross as open ocean. Then her eyes moved to the barn loft, visible through the small, high window she'd never bothered to cover, because it faced north and let in no meaningful heat. She was thinking about something August had told her 2 winters ago, sitting at this same table after the children were in bed, in that particular expansive mood he got when a hard day was behind him and the lamp was low and there was nowhere to be for several hours. He'd grown up in western Pennsylvania in the ridged and forested country that bore no resemblance to the sandhills. His father had taken him once to a bridge across a creek, not an unusual thing, but this bridge was covered. A wooden roof sides of plank, the whole structure enclosed so that you passed through it rather than over it. August had been 7 or 8. He'd been delighted by it in the specific way children are delighted by things that are secretly practical but feel like magic. You could cross in the worst rain and never get a drop on you, he'd said, and his voice, even in the telling, had held something of that original 7-year-old's pleasure. Just walked right through while the storm was going on all around. The bridge didn't know it was raining. Vesper had laughed at that at the time. Now she sat very still. The bridge didn't know it was raining. She wasn't thinking about a bridge. She was thinking about 82 feet of ground between a house and a barn and a canvas wagon cover that had made the journey from Minnesota without a single tear, and was currently folded in the barn loft because she'd saved it on the reasoning that it might be useful someday for grain sacks or patching. 22 feet of heavy cotton duck, treated with linseed oil, stiff with the memory of 10,000 miles of weather. She got up from the table very quietly so as not to disturb the children and went to find the Sears Roebuck catalog. Number 8 cotton duck, the same weight as the wagon cover, the same close weave that had proven its reliability across the trip west, was listed at 8 cents per yard for 60-inch width. She needed enough material to cover a tunnel 82 feet long. She did the calculation, once checked it twice, arrived at 35 yards both times. 35 yards at 8 cents, $2.80. Plus shipping from the Sears warehouse, which the catalog estimated at 50 cents for bulk fabric orders. $3.30 total. She had $312. She sat with that number for a long time. Not because the money was the obstacle, it wasn't not even close, but because spending it meant committing to something she hadn't fully designed yet, something she didn't know would work. Built from materials she'd never used for this purpose in a pattern she was working out on the back of the catalog's order form with a carpenter's pencil while rain drove against the window. The frame would be the harder problem. She'd need a ridgeline, a continuous spine running the full 82 feet, and supports to hold it up, and rafters on both sides to carry the canvas from the ridge to the ground. The cotton would stand along the creek. Her creek held maybe 24 usable trunks, straight enough, strong enough, available without cost, if she was willing to cut them and haul them herself. Which was weeks of work, weeks she should be cutting hay. She knew what Della Pruitt would say. She knew what the survival math said: 6 more tons of hay between now and first snow, or livestock dead in February, or livestock sold to cover shortfalls, or the claim abandoned for failure to maintain the operation. Every hour not spent on hay was a direct subtraction from the margin between success and catastrophe. She thought about Edna Marsh. She thought about Sable, 10 years old, going out into the white to look for her. The rain kept falling. Rue slept. Cade's architectural project had developed a second wing. Vesper found the order form at the back of the catalog, filled it in with the carpenter's pencil, and folded it into her coat pocket. She'd mail it on the next trip to Harlan's Creek. 2 nights after she mailed the order, she woke at 2 in the morning and couldn't find her way back to sleep. She lay in the dark for a while with the specific stillness of someone trying to convince her body that sleep is still possible, listening to Sable's even breathing from the pallet near the window, and the smaller sounds of Cade and Rue sharing the narrow bed in the corner. Outside, the sandhills were quiet. July had been dry, and the grass made no sound without wind to move it. The coyotes that had been audible most nights were somewhere else tonight. She got up. She didn't take the lantern. She knew the layout of the house well enough to move through it by touch: the table edge, the corner of the stove, the 3 steps to the door. Outside, the stars were extraordinary, the way they got in August on moonless nights when the air was dry, not scattered but layered, depth upon depth, of them the kind of sky that makes the ground feel very certain and solid beneath your feet. She stood at the back door and looked toward the barn. The rope was coiled on its hook beside the door, where it lived year-round except when it was needed. She took it down without thinking, the way you handle something familiar, and held the coiled weight of it in her hands. It was a good rope. 3/4-inch hemp, replaced last spring, still flexible and dense. In any normal storm, it would do what it had always done. Her hand knew how to grip it. August's hand had known how to grip it. She looked at 82 feet of darkness. For the first time since the letter, she let herself consider it plainly, and without armor, she might not make it. Not as a thing to fear, but as a true possibility that required honest accounting. She had 3 children asleep in the house behind her. She had $312. She had 42 months remaining on a homestead claim. She had 1 aging horse, 2 cows, and a canvas tunnel that hadn't been built yet and might not work. The alternative was to sell. Aldrin's offer would cover the cost of getting to Kearney with something left over. Kearney had houses with proper lumber walls and stoves that didn't require constant tending, and distances from domestic structures to service buildings that didn't require a safety system to navigate. Kearney had schools within a reasonable distance and neighbors close enough to reach in daylight. Kearney did not have the creek in the southeast corner, or 160 acres of grass that was hers, or the 5 years of work that August had helped start and that she was now the only person who could finish. She stood there for a while, long enough that her feet went cold through her socks. Then from inside the house, barely audible, she heard Rue cough. A small sound, half asleep, the kind of automatic clearing that 4-year-olds do without waking. Nothing wrong with it. Just a child breathing in the night. Vesper hung the rope back on its hook. She went inside. She put her feet close to the stove and waited for feeling to return to her toes. She thought about covered bridges in Pennsylvania, roofs that moved the rain to somewhere irrelevant, walls that made the crossing something separate from whatever the weather was doing outside. She thought about August at 7 years old, delighted walking through while the storm carried on around him. She thought the bridge doesn't need to be permanent. It doesn't need to be beautiful. It doesn't need to last longer than 5 years. It needs to last 1 winter at a time. By morning, she had a rough design in her head and a list of materials she didn't have yet. She started on the cottonwood that week. The work of felling was slow. She'd never taken down a full-grown tree before she'd cut limbs, cleared brush, split wood from trunks August had dropped. But dropping a tree accurately so it fell where you wanted, and not into the creek bank or across the fence line, required an understanding of weight and angle and the direction of lean that she had to learn by doing, which meant the first two trees went wrong, and the third went right, and the fourth went right for a different reason than she'd thought. By the end of the first week, she had 11 usable trunks down-limbed and waiting. She borrowed Cade from his water-carrying duties to help drag the lighter ones to the staging area beside the barn. When Hutchins, the mail carrier, brought the canvas in the first week of September, 40 pounds of rolled fabric tight as a barrel, he watched her wrestle it down from his wagon with the expression of a man filing observations he'd return to later. Going to need a bigger tent, was his assessment. Not a tent. He waited. She didn't elaborate. He shrugged, climbed back to his bench. 50 cents for shipping. Seems like a waste of good duck to me. He clucked at his horse and moved on down the road carrying whatever opinion he'd formed with him. She had $309 remaining. She carried the canvas to the barn and set it against the wall beside the frame materials she'd been accumulating for 3 weeks. Cottonwood poles in graduated lengths, coils of rope, wire she'd bought on her last trip to Kearney, $1, which she'd spent with the precise discomfort of someone who counts every subtraction from a fixed number. Wooden dowels for splints at the joints, 2 hand drills in the bits that fit them, a hammer and the specific nails she'd identified as correct for this purpose after an hour in Dunmore's examining options. She spread the first design drawing on the barn floor and looked at it. It was, she had to admit, ugly on paper. An A-frame structure, 82 feet long, 10 trestle supports, spaced 8 feet apart, 70 rafter poles leaning at angles she hadn't settled on yet. The ridge would be the hardest part. No single cottonwood trunk ran 82 feet, which meant the spine of the whole structure would have to be spliced from shorter sections, and each splice was a place where the assembly could fail. She'd reinforced the design in her mind a dozen times, trying different configurations of lashing and splint, arriving at a solution that satisfied her without fully convincing her. Cormac Aldrin rode up that afternoon while she was peeling bark from a 6-inch trunk in the yard, her hands sticky with sap. He stopped at the fence. He did not dismount. "That's a considerable amount of timber," he said, looking at the staging area. "Fence posts, ridge poles, for a covered passage from the house to the barn." She kept peeling. The bark came off in long strips, revealing wood the color of new bone beneath. He was quiet long enough that she looked up. He was working through it. She could see him doing the arithmetic, the geometry, the logistics. Cormac Aldrin hadn't built what he'd built by failing to understand structures. "Canvas," he said. "Not a question. Canvas." He laughed. It wasn't a cruel. It was the laugh of a man who has decided something is too impractical to take seriously, but is willing to be entertained by it briefly. "Mrs. Holt, you're proposing to build an 82-foot canvas tent connected at both ends to your buildings and walk through this canvas tent in a blizzard with a kerosene lantern. The lanterns will be enclosed, glass chimneys, metal bases. Canvas burns faster than you think it does." "I know how fast canvas burns." He leaned forward in the saddle, and something in his manner shifted not to anger, but to a more serious register, the one he used, she guessed, when he wanted to be heard and not just tolerated. "I'm not saying this to discourage you out of spite. I'm saying it because I've been here 11 years, and I've buried neighbors who thought the country could be outthought. Canvas collapses under a foot of packed snow. The wind will find every gap. And if one coal from that lantern touches the floor, you've got fire running in 2 directions toward your children in the house and toward your hay in the barn, and you're standing in the middle of it. I've considered that." "Have you?" It wasn't quite a question. Knife at each end to cut out sideways. Bucket of dry sand at the midpoint for fire. Lanterns hung high on wire hooks not carried. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in the look had changed. She couldn't have said exactly what, some small recalibration, a man updating a calculation. "The rope works," he said finally. "The rope didn't save Edna Marsh. The blizzard killed Edna Marsh." She let go because she couldn't feel her hands. Vesper set down the bark she'd been peeling and met his eyes directly. "I'm not going to let go, but I need to be holding something I can actually hold on to." Aldrin straightened in the saddle. He looked at the cottonwood poles, at the rolled canvas visible through the barn door at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Not admiration, not quite. Something more reluctant than that and more honest. "The offer stands," he said, "for when you're ready to think practically." He turned his horse. "Mr. Aldrin." He stopped. "I am thinking practically." He rode away without answering. She watched him go, this man who was neither villain nor friend, but simply the pressure the land applied to a woman alone, constant and impersonal as weather. Then she picked up the draw knife and went back to the bark. The pole was smooth underneath, pale yellow, clean-grained. Good wood if she treated the joints right. Good enough. She had 63 days until first hard freeze. She had cottonwood canvas rope wire and a design she'd revised 4 times and would revise again before she trusted it. She had a 10-year-old who could hold a ladder steady, and a 7-year-old who could hand up rope, and a 4-year-old who kept count of everything. She had 82 feet to cover. She started the next morning. The first trestle went up on a Monday in mid-September, and it looked, in Vesper's honest assessment, like something a child had built from fallen branches after a windstorm. 2 poles crossed at the top, lashed with rope at the junction, the legs spread to a width that allowed a person in full winter clothing to pass between them without brushing either side. She'd set it 6 feet from the back door of the house, driving the leg ends 18 inches into the ground, with a mallet tamping the soil tight around each one. When she pushed against it, it moved. Not much, but enough. She drove wooden stakes alongside each leg, wired them to the poles, tamped again, pushed again. This time it held. She stepped back and looked at it against the September sky, this single ridiculous X of cottonwood standing in her yard, and understood that doubt was a luxury she didn't have time for. The second trestle went up better. By the 5th, she developed a sequence pre-drill. The lashing points soaked the rope junction in water before tying so it would shrink tight as it dried, drive the leg stakes before the poles rather than after. Small refinements, each one costing her a morning's worth of wrong before she arrived at right. Sable held the ladder without being asked to hold it, had learned to read the angle of her mother's attention and position herself accordingly. Not behind, not in front, but precisely beside at the distance that allowed her to move fast in whatever direction was needed. By the end of the 3rd week of September, 8 trestles stood in a line from the back door of the house toward the barn, spaced 8 feet apart, each one a little more solid than the last. From the road, Kate had reported they looked like the ribs of some enormous animal lying on its side in the grass. He'd said this with a 7-year-old's appreciation for the monstrous, which Vesper found under the circumstances entirely apt. The ridgepole was the part she'd been circling. No single cottonwood trunk ran 82 feet. Nothing she'd cut from the creek stand came close to that length. The longest was 19 feet, the rest shorter. She'd known from the beginning that the spine of the structure would have to be assembled from sections, each one overlapping the next, and lashed at the joint. She'd spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table working through different configurations of splice, testing the logic of each against what she knew about where force traveled in a structure under load. Snow didn't press evenly. Wind didn't press evenly. The joints were the places where the uneven pressure would concentrate, which made them simultaneously the most critical points in the design and the places she had the least material to work with. She settled on a method each joint would overlap by 18 inches with 2 hardwood splints, shorter lengths of the densest wood she could find, split from a section of hedge apple she'd traded a dozen eggs for with the Lindstrom family, lashed on opposite sides of the junction. Then wire wrapped tight in opposing spirals over the whole assembly, pulled taut with pliers until the splice moved as a single piece rather than 2 pieces in contact. It would be heavier than a continuous pole. It would have stress points the continuous pole wouldn't have. But it was what she had, so she made it as strong as she could make it. She assembled the ridge in sections on the ground, first testing each joint for movement before raising anything. The 4th joint from the house end, the one that landed at almost exactly the 40-foot mark, the midpoint of the whole structure, had a problem she discovered on the 2nd day of assembly. The cottonwood section she'd chosen for that span had a slight curve to it, barely visible to the eye, that became significant when she introduced the load of the sections on either side. The curve meant the joint didn't close flush. There was a gap of perhaps 3/8 of an inch where the overlap met, which meant the wire had to pull across that gap, rather than cinching 2 flat faces together, which meant the splice had less grip than she'd calculated. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't have another section that length. She'd already used every straight trunk from the creek stand, and cutting more would take days she couldn't afford. She added a third splint on the outside of the curve, a longer one spanning more of the adjacent sections, wired it with a double layer, went over the whole assembly, a second time tightening everything she could reach. When she pressed down on the joint with her full weight, it gave perhaps a quarter inch before stiffening. She pressed harder. It held. It would be the weakest point in the entire structure. She knew that the way you know the location of an old injury, not constantly but reliably, particularly when the weather changed. The rafter poles went faster once she'd established the angle. 50 degrees from vertical, she'd arrived at this number through a method that was more experiment than engineering. Propping scrap sections at different angles and pouring a bucket of water over them to see where it sheeted off cleanly versus where it pooled. At 40 degrees, the water moved well, but the interior of the tunnel was too narrow. In a heavy coat and hat, she'd have brushed the canvas walls at every step. At 60 degrees, she had generous interior width, but the water slowed at the lower sections, which meant snow would slow there too, which meant accumulation, which meant weight the frame would have to carry. 50 degrees shed the water in clean runs from ridge to ground and left her enough room to walk without touching the sides. 70 rafter poles, total 35 per side, leaning against the ridge at 2-foot intervals. She set them in pairs, working from the house end toward the barn, one on each side, lashing each one to the ridge at the top, with 3 wraps of rope pulled tight enough to leave marks on the wood. Sable handed the rope up. Cade counted the poles as they went in, announcing each number with the solemnity of an official record, as if the structure needed to know it was being documented. Rue fed the chickens nearby, casting occasional supervisory glances at the construction project. On a Wednesday afternoon in late September, when 9 of the 10 trestles were in place and the ridge was complete and 40 of the 70 rafters were set, Aldrin rode by. He stopped at the fence without dismounting, which she'd come to recognize as his default position for conversations he hadn't decided the outcome of yet. He looked at the skeleton in her yard, the ridge running from near the back door to near the barn wall, the rafters standing in their rows on both sides like incomplete parentheses, the whole assembly casting long shadows in the afternoon light. He looked for longer than she expected. "It's an A-frame," he said finally. "Yes. I've built grain bins with A-frame roofs." He was working something out. She could see it, the engineer in him engaging with the structure against his will, the way a doctor can't stop noticing symptoms. "The pitch matters for snow load. 50 degrees. He was quiet a moment. "That'll shed, if the canvas is tight enough. I'll peg it to the ground on both sides, weight it with sod brick on the edges." Another pause. He wasn't agreeing she understood. He was auditing, which was different. "The joints in that ridge are going to be the problem." "I know. I can see the 4th one from here. It's not lying flat." "I know that too." He looked at her, then not at the structure, at her. Whatever he found in her face, he didn't comment on it. "Canvas goes up when I've finished waterproofing it. 2 coats of linseed oil, 3 days between coats." He nodded once, the minimal acknowledgement of someone who has found less to criticize than he expected. Then he gathered his reins and rode on without another word, which was its own kind of statement, not approval, but the withdrawal of active objection. For Aldrin, she suspected that was a significant concession. She treated the canvas on the first clear stretch of days in October, laying the full 35 yards out flat on the grass south of the house where the afternoon sun was strongest. She worked the oil in by hand with cotton rags on her knees, moving across the fabric in overlapping circles until her shoulders ached and her palms were slick with it. The smell was sharp, vegetative, with an undertone of something older, the smell of work done for a purpose that mattered. The oil darkened the canvas to a deep amber, sealing the cotton fibers, filling the gaps between the weave. When she held a waterproof section up to the light, it was opaque where it had been translucent. Good. She needed it to stop snow, not just slow it. On the 3rd day of the 2nd coat's drying time, she discovered the problem she hadn't anticipated. Linseed oil was flammable. She'd known this abstractly. It was in the basic knowledge of anyone who worked with it regularly, the way you know not to leave oil rags in a pile because they could combust. But standing near the canvas on a warm October afternoon, with the smell of it strong in the air, thinking about the lanterns she'd planned to carry through the tunnel twice a day every day of winter, she understood the problem not abstractly, but concretely, with the specific clarity of someone who has just realized that two things she'd assumed were compatible are in fact in tension. Aldrin's warning about fire hadn't been wrong. It had, if anything, been understated. She sat with it for 2 days through the rest of the drying time, turning the problem in her mind the way she turned hay, methodically covering all the surfaces. The solution when she reached it was imperfect, but imperfect in an acceptable direction. Enclosed lanterns, only the kind with glass chimneys that contained the flame on all sides, metal bases that couldn't tip built to be carried in wind without the flame reaching anything outside the glass. She'd hang them from wire hooks on the ridgepole rather than carry them fixed points of light she could move between high enough that they couldn't contact the canvas walls, even if the walls pressed inward. At each end of the tunnel, a knife hung on a wire hook sharp enough to cut through treated canvas in 2 or 3 strokes and exit in any direction she chose if the tunnel became something other than a safe passage. At the 40-foot mark, a bucket of dry sand. Not water which would freeze before she could use it. Sand, which smothered fire by depriving it of air, which remained loose at temperatures that turned everything else rigid. It wasn't a perfect solution. The perfect solution would have been a tunnel that couldn't burn. But she didn't have the materials for that tunnel, and the one she could build, managed carefully with specific contingencies for specific failures, was better than the rope. She kept that comparison at the center of her thinking. Better than the rope. That was the standard, not perfect. Better. The canvas went up over 2 days in the last week of October. She worked from the ladder, spreading the treated fabric over the ridge and letting it fall down the rafters on both sides, adjusting it by inches until the drape was even, until the peak sat centered on the ridge line and the edges reached the ground with a few inches to spare. Sable held the ladder. The work required climbing up, adjusting, descending, walking to the next section, climbing again, a rhythm of ascent and descent that she kept up for 8 hours each day until she couldn't lift her arms above her shoulders without a pulling ache that didn't fully ease overnight. At the ground, she drove pegs at 45-degree angles, looped the canvas edge over each one, pulled it taut, drove the next. Then sod bricks laid against the canvas base all the way down both sides, cut from the prairie with the same tool she'd used to build the house, set tight against the fabric, heavy enough that the wind would have to tear the canvas rather than lift it. She added guy ropes at each trestle running from the frame to stakes in the ground 3 feet out on each side, the way she'd seen wagon canvas rigged to resist crosswind. When she was done, she stood at the house end and looked down the tunnel. 82 feet of enclosed space, dim with the amber light filtering through the canvas, smelling of linseed oil and cottonwood. The ridgepole ran above it like the spine of some long animal, the rafter poles descending on both sides like ribs. The floor was bare-packed dirt, worn already from her weeks of walking through the frame during construction. At the far end, the canvas flap she'd fashioned for the barnside entrance hung still in the October air. She walked it. 43 steps at her normal pace. 4 minutes by the watch she kept in her coat pocket, timing herself. At the barn end, she pushed through the flap into the familiar smell of hay manure, warm animal breath. Both cows looked up at her approach from the wrong direction, their large, calm eyes registering mild surprise. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment and looked back down the tunnel. The light at the house end was a pale rectangle, distant but visible. She could see the whole length of it. She could walk the whole length of it. It was ugly. Parts of it sagged where she hadn't managed perfect tension in the canvas drape. The trestle at the 6-foot mark listed slightly east, which she'd noticed during construction, and compensated for with an extra guy rope but hadn't fully corrected. The ridgeline had a barely perceptible bow in the middle, where the assembled sections didn't quite achieve the straightness of a continuous piece. None of that was what she was looking at. She was looking at the fact that it was there, that it connected the two buildings, that from where she stood, she could see both ends of it at once. It would need to survive a real storm. She hadn't tested it in anything yet, but she'd built what she set out to build, which was more than she'd been certain of in September. November 2nd brought the first test. Not a blizzard, nothing close. A hard snowstorm, 20 miles an hour of wind, from the northwest, temperature around 10 above zero, the kind of day that would have been unremarkable in any winter, except as context for what she needed to learn. She went out at first light with the enclosed lantern she'd hung near the house end entrance the previous evening, unhooked it, lit it with the matches she kept in her coat pocket, let herself into the tunnel. Inside, quiet. Not silence, she could hear the wind, but she could hear it the way you hear traffic from inside a building, as information about the outside world, rather than as something happening to you directly. Snow struck the canvas with a faint hissing sound she hadn't expected, almost like sand thrown against a drum constant, but not threatening. The air was cold, the same temperature as outside, she estimated, since canvas, insulated nothing but the cold without wind, was a different kind of cold. Manageable. Her hands inside her mittens stayed warm enough to function. She walked the tunnel, 43 steps. The lantern cast moving shadows on the canvas walls. At the fourth joint, the one she'd reinforced 3 times, the one she thought about more than she thought about most things, she paused and looked up. The splice sat above her wire-wrapped, splinted still and solid. No movement in the ridge. She kept walking. She milked both cows, watered the horse, distributed the morning hay. Her fingers worked without the peculiar clumsiness that came with cold severe enough to impair function. She walked back through the tunnel 4 minutes and emerged into the gray morning light. Della Pruitt was sitting on her horse at the edge of the yard watching. So that's the thing. She looked at the structure with the attentive focus she gave to anything she was evaluating seriously. Does it work? In this storm, yes. What about a real one? I don't know yet. There was no point in claiming more than she knew. Della studied the tunnel for a long moment. The canvas was holding its shape, the guy ropes taut against the wind, the snow sliding off the steep pitch in the small continuous avalanches she'd designed it to produce. You said it was like the covered bridges back east. August described them to me. Della's expression shifted slightly, something that wasn't quite sympathy, but was in that direction, an acknowledgement of the particular weight that the dead continue to carry in the lives of the people who carry them. New England has timber frames 100 years old holding those roofs. I have cottonwood in 58 days until January. Della looked at her. Then she looked at the tunnel again. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed, not the dry leaves sound from their earlier conversation, but something with more warmth in it. Aldrin's been telling people at the store you'll be dead before February. He said it again yesterday. Wasn't shy about it. The cold that settled in Vesper's chest at those words had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd known he was skeptical. She hadn't known he was predicting her death at the general store counter. What's his interest in saying it publicly? A dead homesteader doesn't prove up. A failed claim goes to back tax auction. Della gathered her reins. He's not wishing you ill exactly. He's accounting for what he expects. I told him he might be surprised. She turned her horse. I hope your tunnel holds Mrs. Holt. I mean that. She rode into the blowing snow, and Vesper watched her go, standing in the yard with the knowledge of what Aldrin had said settling into her, like cold, settling into ground-deep thorough, changing the temperature of everything below the surface. November passed in maintenance. The tunnel required constant attention in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Wind worked at the canvas edges, finding the places where the ground pegs had shifted in frost, heave opening small gaps where snow infiltrated and built up on the interior floor in thin drifts that would eventually compromise the footing. She repaired these within hours of discovering them, driving new pegs, weighting the edges with additional sod brick, checking the guy ropes for stretch. 3 times she had to re-anchor entire sections where the ground had moved enough to change the tension geometry. Twice she patched tiers, small ones, at points where the canvas had worn against a rough section of rafter pole she hadn't smoothed completely. She'd ordered 10 yards of extra canvas in October as insurance. She'd used 3 yards of it by the end of November. The hay supply was the number she returned to every morning with the reluctant attention of someone checking a wound. 6 tons in the barn, 8 needed. The deficit was fixed now, immovable, the product of weeks spent building instead of cutting. She'd known it was coming. Knowing didn't change the arithmetic, only her relationship to it. She began rationing in November's second week, reduced portions, supplemented with whatever fibrous material the animals could process. Dry leaves raked from the cottonwood stand, coarse prairie grass, too stemmy for ideal feed, but adequate as bulk. Both cows grew leaner. The horse lost the last of the easy flesh along his flanks and moved with the deliberate economy of an animal conserving energy. She watched them daily, calibrating need against supply, making the small adjustments that might add up to survival or might not. On a Thursday in the second week of December, the temperature dropped to 15 below zero overnight. By morning, the tunnel had developed 2 new problems. A section of canvas on the windward side had gone rigid in the cold, and begun pulling away from its pegs, and the guy rope on the fourth trestle, the one above the compromised joint, had stretched enough in the freeze-thaw cycle of the previous weeks that it was no longer providing meaningful resistance to lateral load. She fixed the canvas first, working with fingers that lost feeling every 3 minutes and had to be warmed in her armpits before she could use them again. Then she replaced the guy rope with the heavier gauge she'd kept in reserve, driving the stake 18 inches deeper than the original. She was outside re-anchoring the stake when she heard Aldrin's horse on the road. He stopped at the fence, looked at her working in the 15 below air, looked at the tunnel. He didn't dismount. Surprised it's still up. She drove the stake mallet again once hard. Why wouldn't it be? That wasn't even a bad one. Wait until January. He turned his horse's head slightly a half turn that positioned him to leave. I've buried neighbors who thought they understood this country. The country takes everyone eventually. She straightened, turned to face him. The question is whether it takes you this winter or the next one or 30 years from now. Something flickered across his face. Not amusement, consideration. He looked at the tunnel a moment longer, then rode on without answering. Christmas came quietly, the way it comes to people with no money for ceremony. Vesper made salt pork gravy and cornbread, saved the last of the dried apples for a pie that used more lard than apples but tasted like both. The children had no presents. She told them stories instead. Stories from her father's farm in Pennsylvania, the winters there, the way the ridgetop fields looked under snow, the enormous chestnut tree near the old stone wall that had been old when her father was young. She didn't mention August. She didn't need to. His absence sat with them at the table the way absences do present in every chair, not occupied every story that began with we and now ended with I. Rue asked, "Is winter alive?" Cade with 7-year-old authority. "It's not alive, it's just weather." Rue's expression suggested she found this answer inadequate. Vesper didn't try to improve on it. She thought winter might be the most honest question a 4-year-old had ever asked. January 5th arrived with a deceptive mildness. 15 above zero, light winds, partial clouds, the kind of day that arrived in the middle of hard winters, like a false promise, warm enough to tempt you into thinking the worst had passed. Vesper used the relative gentleness to do a full inspection of the tunnel, walking its length, slowly pressing the canvas at intervals, checking each trestle joint, examining the guy ropes for stretch and abrasion. At the fourth joint, she stopped. The crack had extended. She'd last inspected it closely in late November when it ran roughly a third of the way across the splice. Now it ran 2/3. She could see it clearly in the January light that filtered through the canvas, a dark line following the grain of the wood, precise as a drawn mark, telling her exactly where the failure would propagate when it propagated. Not if, when. She crouched under the ridge and looked at the repair work she'd done in October, the wire, the splints, the doubled lashing. All of it still in place, all of it doing the work it had been designed to do. But the crack had grown despite the reinforcement, which meant the reinforcement was slowing the failure rather than preventing it. She added wire. She didn't have more splints of the right length, so she cut a section from one of the extra rafter poles she'd kept in the barn, split it lengthwise, lashed it alongside the existing splints with everything she had left in the wire coil. Then she stood back and looked at the result. The fourth joint now wore more wire than wood, more rope than grain. It looked like a thing that had been broken and fixed and broken again and fixed again, which was exactly what it was. 7 weeks until spring thaw if the weather ran to normal. 7 weeks for that joint to hold. She went back to the house and told herself she'd done what she could do, which was the only thing you could tell yourself when you'd done what you could do. January 10th brought Della Pruitt back riding through a light snowfall that had been falling since morning. She came to the door this time, which was unusual. She generally kept her conversations in yards rather than kitchens. Vesper understood from this that what she had to say required a table between them. She accepted coffee. She wrapped her hands around the cup, warming them from the inside out. Sable took Cade and Rue to the back of the house with a brevity that told Vesper the 10-year-old had learned to read Della's visits as well. The Bergman boy. Della didn't start with preamble when she had information to deliver. 12 years old, was walking back from the Holcomb place 3 days ago when the temperature dropped. Made it as far as the Jennings hayfield before he couldn't go further. Burrowed into a stack. He's alive. Alive. Frostbite on both hands and his right foot. The doctor in Kearney says he'll likely lose 3 fingers, maybe part of the foot. Della's voice was even carrying the information clearly the way you carry weight you're accustomed to. His mother came to me yesterday. She'd heard about your tunnel. Vesper set down her cup. She said if they'd had something like it between their house and barn, he could have reached shelter. She was crying when she said it. Della looked at the table between them. I told her to come talk to you when the weather lets up. She can come whenever she wants. I thought you'd say that. Della drank her coffee. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove's small sounds, the settling of wood into coals. Aldrin's been quiet lately. Notice that? I noticed. I think he looked at that structure of yours and started doing the kind of calculation he's good at. Not the engineering, the practical. What it costs him if you survive versus what it costs him if you don't. Della's eyes came up from the cup. He'd rather have the creek, but he can read a frame when he sees one. He's revised his expectations. Has he? Don't mistake that for friendship. Della stood carrying her cup to the wash basin with the tidiness of someone who never left a mess in another woman's kitchen. He still wants what he wants. He's just not certain anymore that he'll get it for free. After she left, Vesper sat at the table alone. The children's voices came from the back room. Cade's rising with some argument, Rue's resolute response. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a house that was still running, still functional, still containing the people it was supposed to contain. She thought about this Bergman boy's hands. She thought about what a 12-year-old looks like walking into a haystack because his body has gone past the point of forward motion. She thought about his mother crying at Della's table. The tunnel wasn't finished proving itself. January had barely started. The real weather, the kind of weather the old-timers referenced when they said, "You don't know this country until you've seen what it can do," hadn't arrived yet. She'd built a structure that had survived 2 moderate storms. That was all she knew. It wasn't enough to know. But it was what she had, and she was going to hold it as long as the joint held. January 11th was cold, clear, windless. The sky above the sandhills at dawn was a color she had no name for, not blue, not gray. Something between them that belonged specifically to early January mornings in Nebraska when the cold had weight to it and the light came in low and hard from the southeast. She did her morning chores, walked the tunnel in both directions, noted that the 4th joint had not visibly changed overnight. She fed the children breakfast. She mended a section of Cade's coat where the lining had pulled away from the shell. She went to bed that night with the ordinary accumulated tiredness of a day's work and slept without particular premonition. In the morning, January 12th, she woke to sunlight coming through the oiled paper windows at an angle that felt wrong for the season. Too bright, too warm in quality, the light of a March day somehow arrived 3 months early. She lay for a moment in the unfamiliar warmth of it. The thermometer on the outside of the house read 42 degrees Fahrenheit when she checked it at 7 in the morning. She stood at the back door looking at the yard in the warm light at the tunnel, casting its long shadow at the chickens moving freely around the yard, for the first time in weeks at the horse standing in the paddock with his head up and his nostrils wide, testing the air. She didn't know what the horse was smelling, but she noticed that he was doing it. By noon, Sable had taken Cade and Rue to the creek bank to look at the ice formations that had built up along the edges over the course of the winter. Elaborate architectures of frozen water that wouldn't survive another warm week. Vesper watched them from the door, the 3 of them small against the sweep of the sandhill Sable, keeping the younger 2 back from anything that looked thin, responsible in the automatic way she'd become responsible over these months. The sky to the northwest was clear, completely clear. High wisps of cloud barely visible moving faster than the surface air suggested they should. She went inside to start lunch. At 1:15, Sable came through the door at a pace Vesper recognized before she registered the look on her face. "Mama." Her voice was controlled in the way of a child who has learned that panic is a luxury, but controlled at the edges, only underneath it something urgent and unformed. "There's something coming." Vesper went to the door. The horizon to the northwest had changed. An hour ago it had been sky all the way down to the grass line. Now there was a wall of darkness running from the earth straight up to the point where the eye stopped following it, so solid and vertical it looked less like weather than like a curtain being drawn across the world. Not the dark of clouds which had gradation, which had light beneath it. This had no light beneath it. This was the color of something that didn't allow for light. It was moving fast. Fast in the way that made distance deceptive, that made it hard to know whether it was 5 minutes away or 10 because its scale was too large for normal judgment. "Get your brother and sister inside." Her voice came out steady, which surprised some part of her. "Now." Sable went. At 1:37, by the clock on the mantelpiece, she would always know the exact time. Because she happened to be looking at the clock when it happened, the first gust struck the house. The temperature outside had been 42 degrees at 1 o'clock. At 1:40, it read 24. 18 degrees in 3 minutes, and the number on the thermometer was still falling when Vesper stopped looking at it and started looking at her children. Rue had pressed herself into the corner nearest the stove, knees drawn up, both hands over her ears against a sound she couldn't understand. Cade stood at the window with the fixed attention of a boy who has decided that watching something frightening is better than not watching it, his breath fogging the oiled paper in small, rapid circles. Sable stood in the center of the room, not panicking, not moving, waiting for information that would tell her what to do. The way she always waited now, with a stillness that had come to her faster than any 10-year-old should have had to develop it. The wind had not built, it had arrived. One moment the air was the strange warm stillness of the morning, and the next it was a force that struck the sod walls with enough weight to bring dust down from the ceiling in thin falls that found the gap under the door and drove through it in a continuous cold blade along the floor. The oiled paper windows flexed inward and held, flexed inward and held. From somewhere in the yard, a loose board Vesper hadn't known was loose began a rhythmic hammering that lasted 4 seconds before the wind took it entirely. Sable's voice, "I cannot see the barn." Vesper moved to the window. The girl was right. 82 feet away, the barn had ceased to exist. Everything beyond 10 feet from the house wall had been replaced by white, not the white of falling snow, which had texture and depth, but the white of total suspension of air, so saturated with driven ice crystals that it had become a solid medium. You couldn't see into it. There was no into. There was only the white in the sod wall of the house, and between them, the narrow strip of ground where the world was still recognizable. "Everyone stays inside." She said it with the particular flatness that meant the sentence was not a beginning of discussion. "No one opens the door for any reason." Cade pulled back from the window. "What about the animals?" She didn't answer that because the animals were 42 degrees of temperature drop away, and the answer was that the animals would wait until she knew what she was dealing with. She fed the stove instead, building the fire higher than the coal ration she'd set for emergencies because the emergency had arrived, and there was no point in saving for one that had already started. The children moved closer to the heat without being told. Rue came out of her corner to press against Cade's side, and he let her, which told Vesper more about his understanding of the situation than anything he might have said. By 3 o'clock, the temperature outside had passed 0 and was still dropping. By 5, it reached 20 below. The wind showed nothing suggesting a ceiling. Each gust seemed to find the previous one's level and exceed it, the walls groaning at the peaks of pressure in a register that reminded her of the fourth joint's complaint in the December storm, except that this was the house itself making the sound, the solid sod construction that had seemed impervious to anything expressing its limits. She kept the fire at maximum, feeding it every 40 minutes, burning the coal she'd rationed across 3 months in a single evening, because the alternative was to watch her children's breath fog at the table. At 6, she did the calculation she'd been building since 3 o'clock, the one she'd been hoping the storm would make unnecessary by showing some sign of weakening. Both cows had been milked at 6 that morning. 12 hours was the outer edge of the interval she could allow before the pressure became painful. At 14 hours, the tissue began to stress in ways that healed slowly if they healed. At 16, the risk of permanent damage to the milk production she depended on for what remained of her income became unacceptable. The clock on the mantelpiece read 6:12. She had maybe 2 hours. She built the fire up one more time until the stove's iron sides were too hot to touch. She put on everything she owned in the way of layers: wool underlayer flannel shirt, heavy coat, a second coat on top of that, 2 pairs of socks, boots stuffed with dry hay for insulation, mittens over gloves. She wrapped the scarf twice around her face until only her eyes were clear. She took the enclosed lantern from its hook by the door, checked the fuel, checked the catch on the glass chimney. She turned to her children. Sable was already watching her, had been watching her dress in this accumulation of layers with the focused quiet of someone counting each item as evidence of what was about to happen. Cade had gone very still. Rue was watching Sable's face to know what to feel. If I'm not back in 1 hour, you don't come looking. The words came out even, which cost her something to manage. Keep the fire going. In the morning, go to the road and wait for Hutchins or anyone moving. Don't leave each other. Do you understand me? Sable's jaw tightened once, then released. 1 hour. 1 hour? She looked at Cade. He nodded once, quick a boy trying to match his sister's composure and mostly succeeding. She looked at Rue, who didn't fully understand, but understood enough to stay very still. Good. She opened the door. The wind struck her before the door was fully open, a physical impact across her whole body that staggered her left foot backward before she caught the doorframe with both hands and held on. The cold entered her lungs on the first breath like something sharp, some quality of the air that ordinary cold didn't have, that went past cold into something the body recognized as urgent damage, the air at -28 degrees Fahrenheit moving at 60 miles per hour, carrying ice crystals small enough to find the gap between her scarf and her left cheek before she could turn her head. She couldn't see. She couldn't see her own hands on the doorframe. She couldn't see the ground. She let go of the doorframe. The tunnel entrance was 6 feet to her left, positioned there deliberately in the one decision she'd made during construction that she'd been certain about without needing to test it close enough to reach by feel, placed on the lee side of the door where the house wall would provide 1 second of shelter in which to orient. She lunged left with her arm outstretched, palm open, and her mitten hit canvas. She grabbed it, found the entrance flap, pushed through. The change was immediate, total, the difference between the storm and the tunnel as absolute as walking through a wall. The wind dropped from a roar to a low moan present, but muffled the sound of something happening on the other side of a membrane. Snow stopped striking her face. She could open her eyes. She could breathe without the sensation of her lungs contracting against something hostile. The cold was identical to what waited outside, canvas insulated, nothing the thermometer would have read the same on both sides. But cold without wind was a different country entirely. Her body registered the shift and stopped bracing. She raised the lantern. The tunnel stretched ahead of her in the small circle of its light, 82 feet visible from this end, to the canvas flap at the barn, the ridgepole running above like a taut line, the rafter poles descending on both sides. The canvas walls moved with each external gust, a slow breathing motion, pressing inward a few inches, releasing, pressing again. But they held their shape. The trestles stood. She could see all 10 of them from where she stood, each one a dark X against the amber of the fabric, and none of them had shifted from vertical. She started walking. At the 20-foot mark, one of the lantern hooks had come loose from the ridge, and the lantern was hanging at an angle, not touching the canvas, but closer than she designed it to be. She straightened the hook with her fingers, which already felt thick from the cold, reset the lantern. Kept moving. At the 40-foot mark, she stopped. The fourth joint was directly above her. In the lantern light, she could see the wire windings, the splints on both sides, the doubled lashing she'd added in January 5th's inspection. She could also see the canvas above it pressed down in a dome shape by the weight of snow accumulating on the exterior, the steep pitch shedding most of it, but not all, and what remained was dense, compacted by the wind, driving it into the low point. The ceiling was perhaps 8 inches lower at this spot than it had been in the morning. She pulled the broomstick from where she'd left it propped against the rafter. 3 days earlier, she'd put it there on the 11th. She wasn't sure why, some instinct that it might matter, and pressed the end up against the bulge. The snow gave way with a sliding sound that traveled up through the stick into her palms, a vibration of weight moving. The canvas lifted. The dome reduced itself to a slight depression. Above it, through the fabric, she could hear the snow continuing to fall. She walked the remaining 42 feet. Through the barn end flap into the warmth of animal bodies and hay insulation, where the temperature was still well below freezing, but the wind was nothing, where the darkness smelled of manure and damp grain, and the specific warm exhalation of livestock smells she'd never expected to find beautiful, and did now completely. Both cows turned their heads toward her, their breath visible in the lantern light, their expressions carrying the bovine combination of patience and need that she'd come to read like a second language over the past 18 months. Their sides had the tight, distended look of animals in discomfort. She sat on the milking stool, positioned the first pail, and began. Her fingers worked slowly. The cold had taken enough feeling from them that she had to watch what she was doing, couldn't rely on sensation to tell her when the grip was right. But they worked. That was the only standard that mattered tonight. She milked the first cow, transferred to the second, her mind elsewhere, on the joint above the 40-foot mark on the sound the ridgepole had made when she'd leaned the broomstick against the rafter on the hour she'd given herself. The pails filled, steaming in the cold air. She poured both into the feed trough, no way to carry liquid through the tunnel at these temperatures without it freezing in the pail before she covered half the distance. She kept a small amount in the insulated bottle she'd thought to leave in the barn the previous day, enough for the children's breakfast, nothing more. She watered the horse, cracking the ice on his trough with the heel of her boot. She checked the hay supply by feel in the darkness beyond the lantern's range, running her hand along the stacked bales, estimating 3 tons remaining, maybe slightly less. She didn't let herself calculate what that meant for the next 8 weeks. She walked back. 43 steps. 4 minutes. She pushed through the house end flap into the slight warmth of the house-adjacent air, crossed the 6 feet of open ground with her head down, shoved through the door. Sable was standing 2 feet from the door. She hadn't sat. She'd stood in that spot for however long it had taken, 22 minutes by the clock, maintaining her position, as though her standing there was a form of influence over outcomes she had no other way to affect. When Vesper came through the door, the girl's face did something complicated and brief before it settled back into the composure she'd been practicing since May. The tunnel held. The tunnel held. Sable sat down then abruptly, as though the information had made her legs unnecessary. Vesper made 2 more crossings before the storm reached its worst hours. The second at midnight, the third at 5 in the morning of January 13th. Each time the tunnel holding, each time the fourth joint sitting above her in its cage of wire and rope, without giving way. Between crossings, she tended the fire, checked on the children, Cade and Rue, sleeping in their shared bed with every blanket they owned piled over them. Sable dozing on the pallet near the stove, with her coat still on, and sat at the kitchen table listening to the storm work on the house. The wind didn't diminish through the night. If anything, its character shifted in the early morning hours towards something more sustained, less gusty, a continuous pressure rather than a series of blows, the kind of wind that was harder on structures because it gave nothing a chance to recover between loads. The fourth crossing came at 9 in the morning of January 14th. She almost didn't go. The storm had been running for 20 hours. Every previous time she'd emerged from the tunnel into the house, she'd had less in reserve than the time before, the cold taking its toll in a way that sleep partially but not fully reversed. Her hands had stopped feeling like her hands somewhere around the third crossing and had become instead instruments. She operated by intention, checking their work visually because the feedback from nerve to brain had gone slow and unreliable. But the cows needed her, and the horse's water trough would have refrozen completely by now, and she had enough judgment left to know that stopping while she still could move was worse than going one more time. The wind on the 14th had changed pitch. She noticed it from inside the house, still enormous, still constant, but the highest register of it was gone. The frequencies that had vibrated the door in its frame all night. When she stepped out and reached the tunnel entrance by feel, she found the canvas less rigid than it had been at 5 in the morning, the accumulated snow load on the windward side slightly reduced. The storm was not over, but it had passed its peak. She walked the tunnel one final time, tended the animals, walked back. When she came through the back door and set the lantern on its hook, the clock on the mantelpiece read 9:47. She sat in the chair nearest the stove and did not move for a long time. Sable brought her a cup of water without being asked. Vesper drank it. Through the oiled paper window, the light outside was changing, still white, still wind-driven, but with a quality of brightness in it that had not been there since noon of the 12th. By 2 in the afternoon of January 14th, the wind had dropped to 15 miles per hour. By 4, the sky was clear enough to have color again, the particular hard blue of extreme cold and clean air. Vesper went outside. The damage was real but countable. One rafter pole on the windward side had cracked through the break, clean and sharp, the 2 halves still held in place by the canvas draped over them. The canvas itself had torn along a seam near the barn end flap, a split 12 inches long that flapped slowly in the diminished wind. 2 guy ropes on the east side had pulled their stakes from the frozen ground and lay loose. The fourth joint she inspected at last, saving it the way you save the thing you most need the answer to, had cracked further. The fracture now ran the full width of the splice edge to edge. The joint had not failed. It had not moved from its position or lost its angle or allowed the ridge to sag. But it had nothing left. One more significant load, and it would give. She stood under it in the cold January afternoon light and looked at what 7 weeks of winter had done to the things she'd built in 7 weeks of fall. Then she got the repair materials from the barn and started on the torn canvas seam, working in the 15 below air with fingers she could only use in 4-minute intervals before they needed warming. She was on the ladder sewing the seam closed when she heard Aldrin's horse. He came from the direction of his property to the north, which meant he'd been checking his own outbuildings. He stopped at the fence. For the first time in her memory, he got down from the horse. He tied the animal to the fence post and walked to the edge of her yard, stopping perhaps 20 feet from where she worked. He didn't speak immediately. He stood in the silence of the post-storm afternoon and looked at the tunnel, at the damage at her, working on the damage at the structure that had endured what had just ended. She kept sewing. "Mrs. Lindquist is dead." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, flat in the way of someone delivering information they've already processed alone, without the professional distance he usually maintained. "I went to check on her this morning." Vesper's needle stopped. "I haven't been to her place yet. She made it to the barn. The cows were fed. Fresh hay in the trough." He stopped there, and the stopping itself said the rest. "She was sitting against the wall near the door. The rope between the buildings, the ice on it was too thick. You couldn't grip it through mittens. I don't think she could find the house. She was facing the wrong direction when she went down, 8 feet from the barn door." Vesper sat on the ladder and looked at her needle. Della Pruitt, who had survived 17 Nebraska winters alone, who had told her the rope was what they had, even while knowing it wasn't enough, who had laughed in her yard in November in a way that had more warmth in it than anything else about those months. 8 feet from the barn door, facing the wrong way. "I'm sorry," Aldrin said. The words settled in the cold air without echo. She believed him. Whatever Cormac Aldrin was, he wasn't a man who mourned strategically. He'd known Della Pruitt longer than he'd known Vesper, and the Sandhills didn't produce large quantities of people who lasted 17 years alone. The loss was real, registered in the flatness of how he'd spoken it. She climbed down from the ladder. The full accounting came in pieces over the following days, brought by Hutchins on his resumed mail route, by the Lindstrom boy who came past on horseback, carrying word from the Kearney Telegraph Office, by the accumulating reports of families checking on families across the white expanse of the Sandhills. The number climbed with each telling. 235 dead across Nebraska and the Dakota Territories. 213 of them children caught in the open between schoolhouses and homes when the wall of cold descended at 1:37 on a Tuesday that had begun at 42 degrees. The Olson family 4 miles west, all 5 of them gone, found in a drift, 200 yards from their house, still moving in the direction of the school where their 3 oldest had gone that morning. The schoolhouse itself contained the surviving testament to a different kind of decision, a young teacher named Anna Svensson, who had looked at the northwestern horizon at 1:15 and kept 17 students inside when the afternoon protocol said to release them for home. For 31 hours, she had kept them at the stove, burning the school's coal supply in the first hours, then the wooden chairs, then the desks one by one, then her own furniture from the closet room where she kept her personal belongings, then the school books, working through everything that could be converted to heat until the storm broke. All 17 students walked home on the morning of the 14th. Svensson had not slept for the duration. The Bergman boy, whose case Della had brought to Vesper's kitchen table on January 10th, 2 days before the blizzard, had been at a neighbor's farm when the wall hit. He'd made it to a haystack a quarter-mile from his house. Alive still, but the fingers Vesper had learned about were now certainly gone, along with the front portion of his right foot. He was 12 years old. The Hanson family lost the father between house and barn. The mother survived with her 4 children, but lost both hands to frostbite severe enough that the Kearney doctor provided no optimistic estimate. 4 hands gone to the rope, to the ice on the rope, to the 80 or 90 feet of open ground between structures that had seemed manageable before January 12th. Aldrin had returned to the fence the day after delivering news of Della. He stood for a long time looking at the tunnel while Vesper worked on the cracked rafter pole, replacing it with one of the spares she'd kept in the barn. He'd lost, he told her, 6 chickens and a calf. The calf had frozen, standing in the chuggier section of the barn where the boards had gaps. He'd also, he said, lifting his left hand briefly, lost the feeling in the tips of his first 3 fingers, white and waxy at the ends, dead tissue. She looked at his hand from where she stood on the ladder. From the rope. The ice was too thick to feel through mittens. I knew I was gripping it, but I couldn't feel the tension. I fell twice. The second time I lost the rope completely and spent 20 minutes on my knees finding the barn wall by moving in what I thought were expanding circles. A pause. The barn wall was to my left the whole time. I'd been circling in one direction. She climbed down from the ladder. She set the hammer on the tunnel floor. She looked at this man who had told a general store full of people she'd be dead before February, who had planned to buy her land at back tax auction, who had sat on his horse in her yard and listed every reason her tunnel would kill her. His fingers were white at the tips. His expression was the expression of someone who has encountered the limit of what they knew, which was a particular kind of education the country offered, and the tuition for which it did not negotiate. I was wrong. He said it the way a man says something that cost him, with minimal elaboration delivered straight, the kind of honesty that doesn't dress itself up because it doesn't want to be seen admiring itself. I told people you'd be dead. I'd convinced myself I was reading the situation accurately. 11 years here and I still... He stopped, started again. The rope has always been the answer. It's worked. Most of the time it's worked. He looked at his left hand. Most of the time is not the same as always. She let the silence sit for a moment. What do you want, Mr. Aldrin? He looked at the tunnel, at the trestle joints, at the guy rope configuration she'd developed over 4 months of testing. I want to know how you built the trestles. The lashing at the junction, I've tried to work it out from looking, and I can't get the logic of it. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected capitulation, but she also hadn't expected intellectual curiosity. She looked at him for a moment, this man who was still her adversary, in every land-related matter, who still wanted the creek in her southeast corner, and probably always would. Come back tomorrow, she said. Bring your own canvas. He came back the next day. She showed him the trestle junction, the specific wrap sequence that prevented the lashing from loosening under cyclic load, the placement of the crosspiece relative to the ridge connection. She showed him the wire reinforcement method at the joints, the stake angle that held against frost, heaved the reason for the sand bucket rather than water. He listened with the focused attention of someone who understands structures and is rearranging his understanding of a specific one. He asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. At no point did either of them mention the creek, or the offer that remained unretracted, or the dead woman whose 17 years of survival had ended 8 feet from a barn door. By the end of January, she had made 41 crossings through the tunnel. The 4th joint held through 2 additional storms, each milder than the 12th, each further stressing a fracture that had no further room to grow, but somehow didn't propagate into complete separation. She reinforced it a final time in the first week of February, with the last of her wire winding it until the splice was more metal than wood, warm from the friction of her turning. It held. The Bergman family came in February while the boy was still healing in Kearney. His mother, hands wrapped in bandages that covered what remained of them, stood at the tunnel entrance for a long time without going in. If we had this, she said, and didn't finish the sentence because the sentence didn't need finishing. Vesper told her to come back in the spring when the ground thawed enough to drive stakes. She said she'd show her everything, the frame design, the canvas treatment, the joint reinforcement, the guy rope placement, all of it, nothing held back. It took me most of a summer to figure out, she said. It shouldn't take you that long. By the time the first real thaw came in late March, 4 families had asked to see the tunnel. By the end of April, before the last snow had fully melted from the north-facing slopes, the number was 8. She gave the same information to all of them standing in the tunnel or beside it, showing the joints and the lashings, answering the same questions multiple times without impatience, because she understood that the question being asked was never really about canvas weights or stake angles. The question being asked was, can one person build a thing that works? The answer she gave with the tunnel itself and the questions were just the way people arrived at believing it. Aldrin built his own version in October of 1888 in time for his second winter. He used heavier poles, added trestles at 6-foot spacing rather than 8, sealed the joints with pine tar in addition to wire lashing. He didn't consult her during the construction process, which she hadn't expected him to. The design was recognizably derived from what she'd built: the A-frame pitch, the ridge and rafter system, the stake and sod brick ground anchoring, but modified in the ways an experienced builder modifies something he studied and then rebuilt from his own judgment. She saw it from the road in late October driving back from Kearney, a structure running between his house and his largest barn, steep pitch solidly framed, already canvas draped. She looked at it for a moment as the wagon passed. Then she looked at the road ahead. He never acknowledged the source directly. She hadn't expected him to. He also never raised the subject of the creek again, or suggested remarriage, or predicted her death at the general store counter. Some reckonings happen without words. By the winter of 1889, 9 families within 25 miles of Harlan's Creek had built versions of the canvas tunnel. By 1890, the number was 18. The designs varied. Some used sailcloth instead of cotton duck. Some used willow saplings for the frame instead of cottonwood. One family in the Lute River Valley built theirs with a hinged ridge section that could be propped open on mild days to let light through. None of them failed during a blizzard. None of the families who had them lost anyone to the open ground between their buildings. Some people called it the Holt Passage, quietly, in the way that names attach themselves to useful things in small communities, not officially, not inscribed anywhere, just the name that emerged when someone needed to refer to something specific. Vesper never used the name herself. In May of 1892, she drove to Kearney with Sable beside her on the wagon bench, Kate and Rue in the bed behind Older, now the arguments between them having evolved from blankets to matters of greater complexity, and filed the final paperwork at the land office. 5 years and 3 months after August Holt had staked the claim, the patent came through in her name alone. 160 acres. The creek in the southeast corner. Hers by law, by endurance, by the specific arithmetic of staying when leaving, was the rational option. Aldrin made one final offer for water rights that summer, a formal letter delivered through the Kearney office, politely worded, generous in its terms. She declined in a letter of equal politeness. The correspondence ended there. She occasionally saw him at Dunmore's store in Harlan's Creek over the following years, and they spoke civilly about weather, livestock prices, the state of the county roads. He was not her friend. He was not her enemy. He was the pressure the country had applied to her, and she had held her shape against it, and that was the entirety of what they were to each other. She never remarried. The question came up occasionally in the way it came up for any widow who remained functional, a neighbor's observation, a church acquaintance's well-intentioned arithmetic about practical matters. She received each suggestion with the same courteous deflection. She had her children. She had her land. She had the creek that ran through the southeast corner without interruption year after year, through dry summers and wet springs, reliable in the way that only a thing fed by deep water rather than surface accumulation can be reliable. What else a person needed was a question she had answered for herself and didn't feel required public accounting. Sable grew up and married a school teacher from Kearney who had read about the children's blizzard in a newspaper account and couldn't have known when he arrived to teach in Harlan's Creek that he was settling adjacent to a woman who had built her way through it. They took the quarter section to the north. When Della Pruitt's land went through proper estate proceedings, no family having come forward, the property had reverted, and Sable filed on it as the nearest proven resident. It was in its way a continuation of something Della had started. Cade went into the Army in 1902, was deployed to the Philippines during the final period of the insurrection. There came back in 1905 with a different quality of quiet than the one he'd left with. He ranched in Montana for 30 years, came home when Vesper's health declined, stayed until she died. Rue never left. She managed the homestead alongside her mother through the turn of the century, through the years when the Sandhills began attracting a different kind of settler, with different expectations about what the country owed them, through the slow evolution of the operation from subsistence to modest commercial scale. She never married either, which prompted commentary she found no more interesting than Vesper had. The canvas tunnel came down in stages. In 1895, Vesper replaced it with a wooden frame structure using proper dimensional lumber purchased from a mill in Kearney. More expensive, more permanent, no longer requiring the constant maintenance that had taken an evening a week through every winter of its existence. The cottonwood poles she'd cut from the creek stand went to firewood, the canvas, to patching, and eventually to nothing, the wire salvaged for fence repair. The space the tunnel had occupied was open ground again, bare dirt that the grass reclaimed in the first spring without it. In 1908, the old sod barn burned in a lightning fire on an August afternoon while Rue was in the field. By the time she reached it, the structure was gone, hay tools the post where Vesper had hung the ropes for milking all of it. They built a new barn in a different location slightly closer to the house, with a covered wooden walkway between them from the beginning. The old barn site, cleared of debris, returned to grass. The house remained where it had always been. The winters continued to be what Nebraska winters were. Hard ones came in cycles, mild stretches in between the occasional storm that revived conversations about the children's blizzard among people old enough to remember it. The official count never changed: 235 dead on January 12th and 13th of 1888. The number appeared in historical accounts in the records of the Nebraska territorial government, in the memory of every family who had been present for it. The date settled into the particular category of dates that a place holds in its collective awareness as a reference point before the blizzard. After the blizzard, the winter that killed the Olsons, the winter the teacher burned the desks. Vesper Holt died in February of 1924. 68 years old, in the sod house she had defended through the worst winter the Sandhills had recorded. The house had been improved over the decades: plank flooring, laid over the original dirt proper glass windows, replacing the oiled paper, a wood stove, supplementing the original fireplace, but the walls were the walls she had moved into with August. In the spring of 1886, the same compressed Nebraska sod, the same dimensions, the same slight list to the east that she'd never had money to correct and had eventually stopped noticing. She died in February rather than January, which was the month she'd been assigned by Cormac Aldrin 37 years earlier. She'd been running slightly ahead of other people's predictions for her since May of 1887. Her gravestone in the Harlan's Creek Cemetery gave her name, her dates, and below them 3 words that Sable had chosen and that Rue had approved. She stayed. Simple enough that it required no explanation to people who knew the story. Sufficient for those who didn't to carry the essential fact. In the yard of what had been the Holt homestead, if you walked 82 feet from where the back door once stood, the doorframe still visible in the remains of the sod wall. Packed grass grown up around it, you crossed a strip of ground where the vegetation ran different from the surrounding field. Shorter grass, more dense, the kind of growth that established itself in soil, compacted by repeated pressure over many seasons, that held its character even after the pressure stopped. The strip was 12 feet wide and ran straight from the old house toward the site of the old barn, clearly defined if you were looking for it, invisible if you weren't. Sable showed it to her daughter's daughter on a morning in the spring of 1924. 3 months after the funeral, walking the length of it in the new-growth grass, while the child kept pace beside her. She showed her where the stakes had gone in. You could still find some of them if you dug in the right places. The wire rusted to nothing but the wood, preserved in the dry soil, and where the 4th trestle had stood, the one above the joint that Vesper had reinforced 4 times and watched through every storm of that winter. The child was 8 years old. She walked the strip carefully as if she understood it to be a kind of floor. "Grandma Vesper walked here," Sable said. "Every morning, every night, through the dark, in the cold. 4 times in one night when the worst storm anyone had seen came down in 3 minutes and killed 200 people on the other side of the walls." The child looked down at the ground, then up at the space above where the ridgepole had been. Was she scared? Sable thought about that for a moment, genuinely considered it the way her mother had taught her to consider questions before answering them. She didn't have time to be scared. She had too much to do. A pause. I think that was the point. She stayed busy enough that fear had nowhere to live. The grass moved in the early spring wind off the sandhills, the long sweeping sound of it that Vesper had fallen asleep to for 38 years. The strip of dense, short growth lay in the sun. Somewhere in the southeast corner, the creek ran its quiet, constant course through the season's snowmelt, reliable as it had always been, unaware of what it had cost, unaware of what it had given. The tunnel was long gone. The footprints were what remained, not individual footprints, not anything that dramatic, just the persistent record of a path walked often enough that the ground remembered it. 82 feet from a house to a barn. A distance that had been for one winter in one place, the distance between living and not. She had walked it in the dark. She had walked it in the cold. She had walked it while the world outside the canvas came apart at its seams, and every time she had come out the other side with warm hands and the morning's milk. Every time she came home,